All right, let's dive right into one of the biggest questions in all of science. How does your brain actually create, well, your consciousness? I'm not talking about the deep philosophical stuff, but the real nitty-gritty mechanics. What is actually happening inside your head the moment a sound or a sight or just a random thought pops out of the background noise and into your awareness?
I mean, really think about it for a second. Your brain is getting slammed with information all the time, but you're only consciously aware of what, a tiny little fraction of it? So what's the secret sauce? What's that special something that takes a random signal and pushes it over the finish line, turning it from just data into something you actually consciously experience?
And that is the heart of the mystery, right? You've got these two types of signals. On one hand, you have a subliminal signal. It hits the brain, gets processed a little bit, but then the wave of activity just kind of fizzles out. It never really gets to you. But a conscious signal, whoa, that's a whole different story. It doesn't fizzle. It ignites an entire network. It breaks through, making it available for you to think about, to talk about, even to act on. The big question is, how does that ignition actually happen?
So that very question is what this first part is all about. We're going to dig into a really powerful theory that tries to pinpoint that exact spark of awareness.
Okay, so the leading theory on the table is called the Global Neuronal Workspace Hypothesis, or GNW for short. And the core idea is actually pretty elegant. It says consciousness isn't some thing or some place in the brain, it's an event. It's basically what happens when one piece of information wins a kind of competition to get broadcast across this huge brain-wide network. Once it's broadcast, it's suddenly available to all your other mental tools, your memory, your language centers, your planning abilities, the whole shebang.
Yeah, the easiest way to picture it? Just think of the GNW as the brain's central information router. Its job is to grab the one really important piece of information at that moment and just blast it out, making sure every other part of the brain that needs it gets the message, loud and clear.
And just to be clear, we're not talking about one single spot in the brain. The GNW is a distributed network with these major hubs in the prefrontal and parietal cortex. You can almost think of them like the main servers for the brain's internet. They're all super densely interconnected, which makes them perfect for broadcasting information efficiently. So, okay, we've got the network, but what's the critical event? What actually happens on this network?
Exactly. So, if the global neuronal workspace is the stage, then what's the main event? Well, that's what this next part is all about. The single most critical piece of the theory, something called the ignition moment. This is the tipping point. It's where a signal goes from being a tiny whisper to a massive shout that echoes across the entire brain.
Now, here's what's so crucial to understand. This isn't like turning up a dimmer switch where awareness gradually fades in. Nope. The evidence suggests it's a sudden, all-or-nothing event. It's like flipping a light switch. One moment, the signal is just a local little blip, and the next, bam! A massive, explosive burst of activity lights up the whole workspace. It's a full-on chain reaction.
And here's the wild part. We can actually time this. This explosion of activity happens relatively late. We're talking about 200 to 300 milliseconds after you see or hear something. And what that tells us is pretty profound. It means your conscious awareness isn't the first step. It's a later second stage of processing, where the brain takes that initial sensory info and does something much bigger with it.
And this dramatic event has a name, which we've mentioned. Scientists call it neuronal ignition. It's that exact moment when a local signal finally gets strong enough to set off this self-amplifying wave of activity that just bounces around and reinforces itself all throughout that global neuronal workspace. So let's look at what happens to a signal that doesn't quite make it. Imagine a word flashes on a screen, but it's too fast for you to consciously see it. Well, the signal still hits your visual cortex. You see that first little bump of activity, but then it just dies out. The wave of information just fizzles away into nothing before it ever gets a chance to spread.
Okay, but now let's see what happens when you do consciously see that word. You get that same initial little blip, right? But then, right around that 200 millisecond mark, boom. You see this massive, sustained spike in activity. That is ignition. That's the difference. The signal isn't just processed and dropped, it's amplified, it's held onto, and it's broadcast everywhere.
You know, a really good scientific theory doesn't just explain why something happens, it also has to explain why it doesn't happen. And this is where the GNW model is really, really strong. When we look at what happens when the whole system goes offline and consciousness just fades away.
And the difference is just night and day. When you're awake, the GNW network is humming along, it's dynamic, it's richly connected, and information is broadcast globally. But look what happens when you're under anesthesia or in a deep sleep. that connectivity just breaks down, it gets fragmented. Information gets stuck in these little local loops, so it can't achieve that global ignition we were talking about. The key takeaway here is that the brain is still active, but it's not integrated anymore.
This is a really important point. Anesthetics don't just switch your brain off. That's not what's happening. What they actually do is they systematically attack and disrupt the communication lines of the global neuronal workspace. They basically cut those long-range connections, making it impossible for that ignition to happen. They isolate different parts of the brain from each other.
Okay, so we've seen the network itself, and we've seen this ignition event, which, of course, leads to the biggest question of all. What is this whole complicated system actually for? What's the point? In our last section here, we're going to look at what consciousness actually lets us do.
Let's start with something we all use every single day: working memory. This is basically your brain's mental scratch pad. You know, when you hold a phone number in your head just long enough to type it out? Or when you're trying to mentally picture how your furniture would look rearranged? That's you using your working memory. It's the information you're actively holding in your mind.
And here is where the GNW theory makes a really bold claim. It says that sustained, echoing brain activity we saw during ignition, that is working memory. They're one and the same. The act of holding something in your mind is literally the act of keeping that information ignited and broadcasting across the workspace. So working memory isn't just related to consciousness, it's pretty much consciousness in action.
This quote from one of the core papers on this really nails it. The GNW achieves a coherent model of incoming sensory information, integrating all available multisensory and memory cues. Basically, the GNW's job is to be the ultimate storyteller. It takes all the different streams of information flooding your brain, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, things you remember, and it weaves them all together into a single unified story, your conscious experience.
So let's just walk through the whole process, step by step. First, you get a stimulus that's strong enough to trigger that ignition event. Step 2, that information gets broadcast globally across all those key brain hubs. Third, these looping back and forth signals between the hubs keep that activity going. They sustained it over time. And finally, that sustained broadcast, well, that is the information being held in your mind, ready for you to use.
So when you boil it all down, what the global neuronal workspace theory is really saying is that consciousness isn't some mystical, unknowable ghost in the machine. It's something much more practical. It's an elegant, powerful solution to a very real problem. Out of all the information hitting the brain, how do you pick the single most important thing at any one moment and share it with all the other systems that might need it?
And that leads us to one last, pretty mind-bending thought. If consciousness is, at its core, a specific way of processing information, an architecture, then it suddenly stops being just a biological mystery. It becomes an engineering problem. So it makes you wonder, right? What would it actually take to build a machine with its own global workspace? One that's capable of its own version of ignition? The answer to that question, well, it could change just about everything.